The adoption center in Maplewood, a modest town in Ohio, carried a faint smell of old paper and freshly cleaned hallways. It was a place meant to be filled with hope, with the laughter of children who dreamed of new beginnings. Yet sometimes that hope felt heavy, almost suffocating. On one of the worn benches near the window sat a 10-year-old girl with auburn hair neatly tied into a loose ponytail. Her name was Emily Carter. Unlike most of the children who played noisily in the recreation room or tried to charm visiting families with wide smiles and bright voices, Emily preferred her small corner. On her lap rested a battered notebook, its cover faded, its edges curled. She rarely parted with it. Inside, she filled the pages with houses, yards, and sketches of families she imagined could one day be hers. Emily had been at the center long enough to recognize patterns. Every week couples arrived. Their faces glowed with a mix of nerves and excitement. They would kneel down to greet children, offer candy or soft words, and after hours of conversations, some child would be chosen. Applause would ripple among the staff, and another room in the dormitories would grow empty. Emily had clapped for others more times than she could count, but her own room never lost its occupant. The workers of the center adored her gentle manners and quiet resilience, but deep down they knew that couples often leaned toward children who sparkled with immediate charm, those who seemed easier, more approachable. Emily, with her watchful eyes and calm silence, was too often overlooked. That afternoon, the air seemed different. The golden light of late autumn streamed to the large windows, painting warm patches on the tiled floor. Emily sat cross-legged with her notebook open, sketching a simple drawing of a house with 2 chimneys and a porch. She shaded the roof carefully, her tongue peeking out slightly in concentration. The sound of the door opening made her lift her head. 2 adults walked in, a man and a woman, both dressed with a kind of effortless elegance that didn't belong to modest hallways of the adoption center. The woman's coat was cream-colored wool, her hair falling in smooth waves over her shoulders. The man wore a tailored jacket, his stride confident yet measured. The staff welcomed them warmly, explaining the process, offering coffee, and leading them toward the playroom where children gathered. Emily did not move from her bench, but her eyes followed them intently. She felt her heart press harder against her chest, that quiet and dangerous rhythm of hope. She had trained herself not to feel it, to keep her expectations folded away like the pages of her notebook. But sometimes, despite all the walls she built, her chest ached with the possibility of being seen. The couple's laughter echoed faintly as they spoke with the social worker, but eventually their eyes scanned the room. For a fleeting second, they landed on her. Emily's small body straightened, almost without her consent. She held her notebook tighter, the pencil frozen between her fingers. Their gaze lingered long enough for her to imagine the impossible. Maybe today was different. Maybe the people who walked in weren't just visitors. Maybe, just maybe, they were hers. The social worker, noticing Emily's quiet attention, smiled softly and gestured toward her. Emily's pulse quickened. She tried to appear calm, her lips pressing into a shy line, but her eyes betrayed her. For a moment, she let herself believe. She imagined the woman kneeling down beside her, asking about her drawings, admiring the house with the 2 chimneys. She imagined the man smiling kindly, his voice warm, saying words that sounded like belonging. Her chest swelled with something dangerously close to joy. The kind of joy she had taught herself to guard, because every time she let it rise, reality swept in and crushed it. But hope was a stubborn thing, and on that day it refused to stay buried. The couple took a few steps closer. Emily's breath caught. She could already feel the weight of the moment pressing against her. Her thumb brushed over the worn cover of her notebook, as if the sketches inside might shield her heart from disappointment. The woman's eyes softened as she looked at Emily, and the faintest smile crossed her lips. For the briefest heartbeat, Emily was sure it was happening. The impossible, the miracle, the choice she had waited for. But life, as she had learned far too early, had a cruel way of turning in the opposite direction just when the world seemed about to open its arms. What unfolded in the next few minutes would not only shatter Emily's fragile hope, but would leave an imprint on everyone who witnessed it. Because sometimes the moment you believe you are finally seen is the very moment the world reminds you how invisible you really are. And for Emily Carter, That reminder was coming faster than she could prepare herself for. And when it did, it would change not just her life, but the lives of strangers standing in front of her, in ways none of them could yet imagine. Emily followed the social worker into a small visitation room at the end of the corridor. The room was simple, with 2 armchairs, a wooden table, and walls painted in a muted beige meant to feel welcoming. On the table sat a small vase of flowers, as if something cheerful could disguise the formality of what these meetings usually meant. Emily's heart beat quickly in her chest, but she forced her face into quiet calm she had practiced so many times. She smoothed down the pages of her notebook and kept it close to her side as though it might give her courage. The couple was already waiting. The man, Thomas Bennett, offered a polite smile when Emily entered, though his eyes betrayed a hint of hesitation. The woman, Rachel Bennett, leaned slightly forward in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression was carefully measured, the kind of look adults wore when they were uncertain but didn't want to show it too openly. The social worker encouraged Emily forward with a reassuring hand on her shoulder before stepping aside to let them speak. "Hello, Emily," Thomas said in a voice that was both kind and distant, like someone addressing a neighbor's child rather than a possible daughter. "Hi," Emily replied softly, her eyes flicking between them. She sat in the chair across from them, her small hands gripping her notebook tightly. For a few moments, silence pressed against the room, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Rachel cleared her throat. "Do you like drawing?" she asked, nodding toward the notebook. Emily hesitated before opening it slightly, showing a page with a sketch of a house. "Yes," she whispered. "I draw families sometimes, and houses with yards." There was something vulnerable in her tone, a quiet offering of herself, as though each word carried the weight of fragile hope. Rachel looked at the drawing briefly, her lips pressing into a thin smile. She did not say it was beautiful. She did not ask which family Emily had imagined. Instead, she exchanged a glance with Thomas. A subtle look that Emily, even at 10 years old, could sense was full of unspoken doubt. Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Do you like school?" he asked. "Yes," Emily answered quickly. "I like reading the most." She paused and added, "And I'm good at writing stories." She tried to sound confident, but her voice wavered, betraying the truth. She wanted desperately to be liked. Another silence fell. Rachel shifted in her seat, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. She studied Emily with eyes that seemed less curious and more calculating, as if searching for flaws. Emily could feel it, the weight of being measured, of being silently compared to an invisible checklist of qualities she might never meet. Her chest tightened as she clutched her notebook closer. After several more polite questions, Rachel leaned toward Thomas and whispered something low, almost inaudible. Emily caught only fragments, too quiet and seems difficult. Thomas gave a slight nod. He turned back to Emily with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Emily," Rachel said, rising from her chair, her tone clipped but courteous, "thank you for speaking with us today. It was very nice to meet you." Emily blinked, confused. She looked from Rachel to Thomas, searching for any sign that this wasn't what it seemed. "Are you leaving already?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes," Thomas said, his smile faltering. We just don't think this is a right fit." The words stung sharper than Emily had expected. She felt her throat tighten, her vision blur at the edges. She tried to swallow the rising tide of emotion, tried to hold her composure the way she had so many times before. But this moment was different. She had allowed herself to believe, if only for a few breaths, that maybe they saw her. And now, with a few simple words, that hope crumbled. "Did I do something wrong?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "No, sweetheart," Thomas replied quickly, though his gaze slid away from hers. You seem a little difficult. We're looking for her." He trailed off, struggling to finish the sentence without sounding cruel. Rachel touched his arm lightly, urging him toward the door. Emily's chest felt like it was collapsing inward. Her hands shook as she gripped her notebook so tightly that the cover bent under her fingers. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of them, but as the couple turned their backs, walking toward the exit, the words escaped her lips before she could stop them. "You're looking for a perfect daughter," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I just wanted someone imperfect enough to love me for real." The words hung in the air like a heavy stone dropped into still water. Rachel froze mid-step. Her shoulders stiffened, her hand tightening against Thomas's arm. Thomas stopped too, though he did not turn immediately. For a long moment, no one moved. The social worker shifted uncomfortably by the doorway, her expression caught between sympathy for the girl and professionalism toward the couple. Emily lowered her gaze, ashamed of the tears welling in her eyes. She hugged the notebook to her chest, wishing she could disappear into its pages, into the houses and families she had drawn where no one ever left her behind. Rachel finally looked over her shoulder. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of surprise, discomfort, and something else she couldn't name. But she said nothing. She turned back toward the hallway, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked away. Thomas followed, his jaw clenched, his silence heavy. When the door closed behind them, the room felt unbearably empty. Emily sat perfectly still, her small shoulders trembling as she pressed her notebook against her face to hide her tears. The social worker approached slowly, kneeling beside her, but Emily pulled away, shaking her head. She did not want comfort. She did not want words about how it wasn't her fault. She had heard them all before. For Emily, the rejection was not just another family lost. It was a confirmation of a fear she had carried deep inside, that no one would ever choose her, no matter how carefully she tried to be the kind of girl they wanted. And though the Bennetts walked out of that building convinced they had made a reasonable choice, the echo of Emily's trembling words would follow them far beyond those beige walls. And for Rachel, that echo would prove impossible to silence. The car ride back from the adoption center was wrapped in silence. Thomas guided the vehicle through quiet streets of Maplewood, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the air. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, gripping the wheel with the kind of tension that betrayed his unease. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the window, watching the blur of autumn leaves flutter past. But her mind was not on the trees or the streets. It was still back in that small beige room where a girl with wide, tired eyes looked straight at her and spoke in words that now repeated endlessly in her head. "You're looking for a perfect daughter, but I just wanted someone imperfect enough to love me for real." The phrase would not let her go. She replayed it again and again, the way Emily's voice had cracked, the way her small shoulders had seemed to fold in on themselves. Rachel pressed her lips tightly together, as if doing so could hold back the tide of emotions rising inside her. She had thought she was prepared for the process of adoption, prepared to meet children and decide whether they were the right fit for her and Thomas. But nothing could have prepared her for being confronted with such raw honesty. Thomas eventually broke the silence. "Ratch, don't do this to yourself. She's just a kid. She doesn't understand how complicated this is." Rachel turned her head sharply, her eyes flashing with something close to anger. "Doesn't understand?" She understood enough to see through us in less than 5 minutes. She understood more than we gave her credit for. Thomas sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Look, I know it was hard to walk away, but you felt it too." She seemed withdrawn. Maybe she'd need more than we could handle. We have to think about what's best for us too. Rachel leaned back in her seat, folding her arms across her chest. She didn't answer, but inside, his words only deepened the unrest that had already taken root. For years she had lived with a carefully curated vision of what motherhood might look like. Bright mornings, laughter in the kitchen, tidy family photographs. But Emily's words had cut through that dream like a blade, revealing something darker beneath. Rachel realized, with growing discomfort, that what she and Thomas had been searching for wasn't a child to love, but an idea, a fantasy polished into perfection. The following days unfolded with a deceptive sense of normalcy. Rachel went through her routine. Early mornings at the law office where she worked as a paralegal. Late evenings spent preparing dinner. Casual conversations with Thomas about work and errands. But no matter how ordinary the hours seemed, the echo of Emily's trembling voice threaded itself through everything. When Rachel flipped through case files, she caught herself writing the girl's words in the margins before quickly scratching them out. When she tried to sleep, she would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, hearing that sentence as if it had been whispered in her ear. At lunch with her colleagues one afternoon, Rachel found herself distracted, staring at the children playing outside the cafe window. Their laughter rang out, messy and imperfect, and for the first time, Rachel realized she had been measuring children against a standard that didn't even exist. Her own childhood surfaced in her thoughts, unbidden and unwelcome. She remembered the rigid posture of her father at the dinner table, the way he corrected every mistake, the way her mother praised her achievements but never her efforts. She remembered being told over and over that she was capable of more, that she could do better, that there was always some higher bar she had not yet reached. Love in her house had always felt conditional, earned rather than given, and she had carried that unspoken rule into her adult life, even into this search for a child. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed while Thomas read through emails on his laptop. She stared at her hands, twisting her wedding ring absent-mindedly. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever wonder for the problem?" Thomas glanced up, frowning. "What are you talking about?" Rachel looked at him, her eyes tired. "Emily, that day, she said we wanted someone perfect. And maybe she's right. Maybe we've been looking for something that doesn't exist." Thomas closed the laptop with a sigh. "Rachel, you're overthinking this. We'll find the right match. We just have to be patient." "But what if there is no right match?" she pressed, her voice rising slightly. "What if the problem isn't the children? What if it's us, what we expect, what we demand?" She reminded me of something I've tried to forget my whole life. How exhausting it is to never be enough. Thomas rubbed his forehead, frustration flickering across his face. "We can't save every child we meet, Ratch. We need to be realistic. Maybe Emily isn't the one for us." Rachel stood abruptly, her chest tight. She walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street, the glow of the lamppost casting long shadows. "Maybe you're right," she said softly, "but I can't stop hearing her voice. And I don't think I can just walk away from it." Thomas didn't answer. He leaned back against the pillows, his silence signaling the end of the conversation. But Rachel's mind was far from finished. That night, as sleep eluded her once more, she turned over Emily's words like stones in her hands. She began to see not just a child left behind, but a reflection of herself at 10 years old. A girl who had once longed for someone to love her despite her mistakes, her quietness, her flaws. And the more Rachel wrestled with it, the clearer it became. She could not let this be the end of Emily's story. Not if she had anything to say about it. Because some words are too powerful to ignore, and Rachel Bennett was about to realize that Emily Carter's words were not only about the girl in the adoption center, they were about her too. 3 days after the visit to the adoption center, Rachel could no longer silence the storm that had taken root inside her. She had tried. She had buried herself in work, let the hours stretch late into the night at the office, cooked elaborate dinners as though chopping vegetables with precision could distract her mind. She had nodded along to Thomas's reassurances that the right child would come along, that the process simply required patience. But none of it mattered. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emily sitting in that beige room, clutching her notebook, her voice cracking as she uttered words Rachel couldn't forget. It wasn't just guilt that gnawed at her. It was recognition, an undeniable connection she couldn't explain away. On the 4th morning, Rachel found herself driving back to Maplewood without telling Thomas where she was going. The roads were familiar now, yet the weight in her chest was heavier than before. When she pulled into the parking lot of the adoption center, her palms were damp against the steering wheel. She sat there for a moment, gathering courage, before finally stepping out of the car. The air was crisp, the sharp bite of autumn edging toward winter, and Rachel pulled her coat tighter as she walked toward the entrance. Inside, the receptionist looked surprised to see her. "Mrs. Bennett? I wasn't expecting you back so soon. Is your husband with you?" "No," Rachel said quickly. "This is just me today." She hesitated, then added, "I'd like to see Emily, if that's possible." The woman's expression softened, but there was hesitation in her voice. "Emily hasn't spoken to anyone since the last visit. She's been quieter than usual, withdrawn. I don't want to get your hopes up if you're expecting a cheerful reunion." Rachel's chest tightened. "I'm not expecting cheerful," she said. "I just need to see her. After a pause, the receptionist nodded and led her down the familiar corridor. The walls seemed narrower this time, the beige paint more suffocating. Rachel's heels clicked softly against the floor until they reached a door halfway down. "She's in here," the woman said gently. "But please be patient with her." Rachel nodded, then pushed the door open. The room was small, with a single table and a scattering of colored pencils. Emily sat at the far end, her shoulders hunched as she bent over her notebook. She was drawing, the pencil scratching lightly against page. She didn't look up when the door closed, though her grip on the pencil seemed to tighten. Rachel hesitated, her heart pounding, before slowly crossing the room. She pulled out the chair beside Emily, but didn't sit immediately. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her voice low. "Hi, Emily." The girl froze but didn't answer. Rachel waited a moment, then sat down quietly. For several long minutes, the only sound in the room was the scratching of Emily's pencil. Rachel watched as the girl outlined a simple house with wide windows, adding a swing set in the corner of the yard. The drawing was small but deliberate, every line placed with care. Rachel's throat tightened. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I used to be afraid of making mistakes," she admitted, her eyes fixed on the drawing. "Afraid that if I wasn't perfect, people wouldn't want me." Emily's pencil slowed, but she didn't look up. Rachel took a breath, her hands trembling slightly on her lap. "I think I've lived most of my life trying to be exactly what others expected. Always polished, always in control. But do you know what I realized, Emily?" She swallowed, her voice catching. "I never had the courage to just be imperfect. Not until now." The pencil stilled. Slowly, Emily lifted her eyes, meeting Rachel's gaze for the first time. Her expression was guarded, wary, but there was a flicker of something else. Curiosity, maybe even a fragile hope. Rachel reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She laid it gently on the table between them, pushing it toward the girl. "I drew something for you," she said quietly. Emily blinked in surprise, then hesitantly set down her pencil. She unfolded the paper. Inside was a rough sketch, nothing polished, certainly not as detailed as Emily's drawings. But it was heartfelt. Rachel had drawn a family, a man, a woman, and in the middle, a small girl holding a notebook. Emily's fingers lingered on the paper, tracing the lines with care. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. For the first time in days, her eyes lifted fully to Rachel's, shimmering with an emotion she had tried to bury. "I don't know what's going to happen," Rachel admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't even know if Thomas is ready for this. But I couldn't stop thinking about you. And I don't want you to think that your words didn't matter, because they did. They changed something in me." Emily clutched the paper tightly, as if it were a lifeline. For a moment, her walls cracked, and the silence that had wrapped around her since the rejection loosened. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she held the drawing to her chest, her small hands trembling. Rachel felt her own eyes sting. She resisted the urge to reach out and touch the girl's shoulder, sensing that it would be too much, too soon. Instead, she simply stayed beside her, quiet but present. The air between them felt charged, as though something fragile yet unbreakable had just taken root. For the first time since that painful day, Emily allowed herself to look at Rachel not with resignation, but with a question, a silent wondering of whether this woman might truly mean what she said. Rachel didn't need to hear the question. She answered it with her steady gaze, with a quiet determination in her heart. She had come here not to undo the past, but to open a door that had nearly been closed forever. And though the air in the room was heavy with unspoken fears, it carried something else now, too, the possibility of a beginning neither of them had expected. The next morning, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee she had not touched. The house was quiet except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of traffic outside. Thomas entered the room, adjusting his tie, already prepared for a day at the office. He glanced at her, noting her pale face and distant expression. "You didn't sleep again," he said softly, though there was no question in his tone. Rachel lifted her eyes to him, her hands folded tightly together. I went back to the center yesterday. Thomas froze mid-step, his briefcase dangling loosely in his hand. You what? I went back, Rachel repeated, her voice steady but charged with emotion. I saw Emily. She hasn't spoken to anyone since we left, but she let me sit with her. She listened, Thomas, and for the first time, I think she believed I wasn't there to judge her. Thomas sighed, rubbing his forehead. Rachel, we talked about this. We agreed she wasn't the right fit. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time in weeks, her voice sharpened. No, you agreed. I stayed quiet, but I can't anymore. That girl is sitting in that center with no one to believe in her, and I can't be the woman who turns away again. He placed his briefcase on the table, his expression tightening. Do you hear yourself? This is a life-altering decision. It's not about guilt or trying to fix some memory from your childhood. It's about whether we can handle this. And I'm not sure we can. Rachel leaned forward, her voice low but fierce. When did love become about what we can handle? She doesn't need perfect parents, Thomas. She just needs someone who won't walk away the moment she doesn't shine the way we expect. Thomas stared at her, conflicted, torn between logic and the pull of something deeper. Finally, he dropped into the chair across from her, running a hand through his hair. His voice softened, carrying a hint of defeat. You really believe she's the one? Rachel nodded, her throat tightening. I don't just believe it. I feel it. And if we don't go back, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. For a long moment, the room was silent, heavy with the weight of choice. Then Thomas exhaled slowly, almost as if surrendering. Fine, let's go see her together. But, Rachel, if this is what we're doing, then we do it with open eyes. No fantasies, no illusions. Relief washed over her, but she didn't smile. Instead, she reached across the table and touched his hand gently. No illusions, she agreed. Just love, as imperfect as it comes. Later that afternoon, they returned to the adoption center. This time, Thomas walked beside Rachel, his steps heavy, uncertain but resolute. The receptionist's eyebrows rose in surprise when she saw them. Back again? She asked cautiously. Rachel gave a small nod. We'd like to see Emily. Both of us. The woman hesitated, but led them down the hall once more. The same beige walls seemed less suffocating this time, though the anticipation that clung to Rachel's chest was overwhelming. When they entered the visitation room, Emily was there again, seated with her notebook, tracing lines absent-mindedly. Her eyes flicked up at the sound of the door, then quickly dropped back to the page when she saw Thomas. Rachel stepped forward slowly, her voice gentle. Emily, I brought someone with me today. She looked at Thomas, urging him forward with a glance. Thomas cleared his throat, his tall frame casting a shadow across the table as he lowered himself to one knee in front of the girl. He wasn't a man given to displays of vulnerability, but in that moment, his carefully built walls cracked. He looked into Emily's guarded eyes and spoke with a raw honesty that surprised even himself. Emily, he began, his voice unsteady, maybe you were right about us. Maybe we have been chasing something perfect that doesn't exist. And maybe that's why we almost miss what's really important. He paused, searching for words, then continued, his throat thick with emotion. We don't know how to be perfect parents, but we do know how to try. And if you'll let us, we want to try with you. The room was so quiet that Rachel could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Emily's small hands tightened around her notebook, her eyes shimmering with tears she tried to hide. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. Rachel's heart pounded, her chest aching with the fear that silence would be the only answer. Finally, Emily's lips parted, her voice fragile but steady. I don't want perfect parents, she whispered. I just want a chance to be someone's daughter. The words pierced the air, and Rachel's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. Thomas closed his eyes, his head bowing as though the weight of those simple words had broken something open inside him. When he looked up again, his gaze was steady. Then maybe we finally found each other, he said softly. The weeks that followed moved quickly, filled with paperwork, home visits, and long conversations that tested both their patience and their resolve. But through it all, Rachel and Thomas never wavered. Each step, Each form signed, each meeting attended carried with it the memory of Emily's trembling words and the promise they had made in that small room. When the adoption was finalized, Emily moved into the Bennett home with little more than her notebook and a cautious heart. The first days were quiet, filled with tentative exchanges and careful distance. But slowly, trust began to take root. Rachel hung Emily's drawings on the fridge, each one celebrated as though it were a masterpiece. Thomas, awkward at first, built a swing set in the backyard with his own hands, determined to give life to the image Emily had drawn. One crisp evening, as the sun set over Maplewood, Emily sat on that swing, her notebook resting on her lap, her hair catching the golden light. Rachel and Thomas stood on the porch, watching her laugh for the first time since she had come home. It wasn't loud or unrestrained, but it was real, fragile, and beautiful in its imperfection. Neighbors would later ask how the Bennetts had chosen Emily, how she had come to be theirs. And every time, Rachel would smile softly and answer the same way. We didn't choose her. She chose us, with a single sentence that changed everything. And in that truth, they all finally understood. Love had never been about perfection. It had been about the courage to stay, flaws and all, when staying mattered most.